The first sound was the crack of a whip, sharp and final, followed by a gunshot that tore the afternoon quiet to shreds. The stagecoach lurched, a wounded beast, groaning to a halt in a cloud of its own dust. Inside, Maeve Carson was thrown against the opposite seat. The jolt, a brutal punctuation mark on a journey already defined by loss. Dust, fine as powdered bone, seeped through the cracks in the carriage, coating the air in a hazy, suffocating light. Outside, men were shouting. Rough voices laced with the casual cruelty of those who took what they wanted without a thought for the cost. A passenger across from Maeve, a portly man in a sweat-stained suit, fumbled for a pistol tucked in his waistcoat. "Fools," he muttered, his face a mask of blustering fear. "They'll get nothing from me." The coach door was wrenched open, and a figure blocked the sun. He was tall, his face obscured by a dusty bandana, but Maeve's eyes were drawn to his hand as it gripped the doorframe. Burned into the back of his leather glove was a coiled serpent eating its own tail. It was a strange, unsettling mark, one you wouldn't forget. "Step out," the man commanded, his voice a low growl. "Leave your belongings. We're just collecting a tax for the road." The passengers stumbled out into the oppressive heat, hands raised. The red mesas burned under the relentless sun, vast and indifferent. There were 4 robbers, all masked, all moving with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. They weren't interested in pocket watches or wedding bands. They moved straight to the strongbox bolted to the back of the coach. The portly man with the pistol made his mistake. As one of the robbers passed him, he drew his weapon. Not another step, he puffed the gun trembling in his hand. The leader with the serpent brand didn't even turn his whole body. He simply pivoted at the waist, his own pistol appearing in his hand as if from thin air. The shot was deafening. The portly man crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. A woman screamed. Maeve felt a cold sickness rise in her throat, but she didn't make a sound. She stood perfectly still, a ghost in a worn-out dress, her mind screaming a litany learned through a lifetime of hardship: be small, be silent, survive. The robbers ignored the body. They worked at the strongbox with a crowbar, the shriek of metal on metal grating against the sudden ringing silence. It finally gave way with a groan. The leader reached inside and pulled out a smaller iron-banded lockbox. He didn't open it. He just hefted it, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes, and tossed it to one of his men. "That's it," he said, his gaze sweeping over the terrified passengers. "The rest is yours." As he turned to leave, his eyes snagged on Maeve. Or rather, on the glint of something at her neck. It was a simple wooden locket carved from a piece of oak by her late husband's own hands. It held nothing of value, just a faded sketch of his face. But it was the last piece of him she had left in the world. Before she could react, he strode toward her. "What's this?" He sneered, his branded glove reaching for her. "It's nothing," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Just wood." He wasn't listening. He ripped it from her neck, the cord snapping and biting into her skin. He glanced at it, saw its worthlessness, and tossed it into the dirt with a grunt of disgust. In the scramble to mount their horses, a heavy boot came down on it. Maeve heard the crack of splintering wood, a sound that broke something deep inside her. The robbers galloped away, disappearing into the heat shimmer, leaving the passengers stranded miles from the nearest town, Sweet Rock. They left behind a dead man, a looted stagecoach, and a woman who had just lost the final anchor to her past. Maeve knelt in the dirt, her fingers trembling as she gathered the shattered pieces of the locket. The face inside was gone, obliterated. She was utterly, irrevocably alone. The road north was a long, unforgiving ribbon of dust. 2 days of walking had worn the soles of her shoes to paper and filled the cracks in her soul with despair. Sweet Rock, when she finally stumbled into it, was little more than a single dusty street flanked by sun-bleached buildings. It offered no welcome, only the weary indifference of a place that had seen too many desperate souls pass through. For a week, Maeve existed in the town's margins, a wraith sleeping in alleyways and behind the livery, eating what scraps she could find or go without. The nights were the worst, cold and vast, filled with the howls of distant coyotes that sounded like loneliness given a voice. She found the Merrick Ranch by accident, following the scent of hay and the promise of shelter from a biting wind. The barn was quiet, its shadows deep and welcoming. She had slept there for several nights, a trespass she knew was a risk, but one her exhausted body demanded she take. The scrape of boots on gravel jolted her from a fitful sleep. She sat up, heart hammering against her ribs, and pulled the thin fabric of her coat tighter. The barn door creaked open, slicing the darkness with a blade of morning light. A man's silhouette filled the frame, broad at the shoulders, shadowed at the jaw. Maeve held her breath, expecting the usual litany of curses and threats. "I ain't here to throw you out," the man said. His voice was low and steady, devoid of anger. Maeve didn't answer. She had learned long ago that a man's first words were rarely his truest. Kindness could be a lure, a prelude to something far worse. "I brought food," he added. She squinted her eyes, adjusting to the light. He held a tin plate. Then the scent hit her, bacon and coffee, real and warm. Her stomach coiled into a tight, aching knot, a betrayal she couldn't control. The man stepped forward, his movements unhurried, and handed her the plate. The heat radiated from it like a forgotten mercy. She took it, her fingers clumsy, but didn't thank him. Not yet. She looked up at him properly for the first time. He was a hard man, not in the cruel sense, but in the way of weather-beaten pine, silvered by years of sun and wind. Lines were carved around his eyes, and his hands were the gnarled, calloused hands of someone who worked the land until it bled. His gaze was direct, meeting hers without pity or judgment. "You got a name?" he asked. "Maeve," she managed, her voice hoarse. He nodded, once a short, economical movement. "John Merrick." She knew the name. The whispers in town had painted a stark picture, a rancher, a widower, a man with 3 children who kept to himself. Folks called him quiet, but Maeve had learned the difference between quiet and cruel. John sat on a nearby hay bale, his hands resting on his knees. He watched her eat the silence stretching between them. "I'm not staying." Maeve said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "Just needed a place out of the wind." "I know. I won't steal nothing." "I know that, too." The simple certainty in his voice undid her more than any kindness could have. He believed her. "You were sleeping here last week, too," he observed, his tone matter of fact. Maeve stiffened, shame crawling up her neck. "Only a few nights." "I ain't here to shame you. I'm here to offer something." Her head snapped up, suspicion returning like a reflex. "I don't do that kind of work." A muscle feathered in John's jaw, and a flicker of something, pain maybe, or regret, passed through his eyes. "I got 3 kids," he said, his voice dropping. "They eat what I burn and wear what I mend poorly. I need someone who can cook better than me and clean better than a pack of wild dogs. Someone who ain't afraid of early mornings or stubborn young'uns." Maeve's throat felt tight. "You're offering work." "I'm offering a place," he corrected her gently, "with pay and a roof. You sleep inside, eat at the table. If my kids don't take to you, we part ways. No harm done." She stared at him, the offer hanging in the air like a miracle she didn't trust. A man like him in a place like this didn't have to offer anything to a woman like her. "There's women in town better suited," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "Ones who can still have more children. I'm not looking for a wife." He said, his voice flat and final. "My wife is gone." I'm looking for someone who knows what it's like to need a second chance." The words struck her like a physical blow. She lowered her eyes, her heart thudding a loud, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hadn't felt like a woman in years, more like a ghost, haunting roads where no one ever looked twice. The simple idea of a chair at a table of warmth that wasn't stolen from the sun felt like a dangerous, impossible dream. "Why me?" she whispered. John looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Because you didn't beg." That was it. That was the thing that finally broke the dam inside her. Her throat closed, and her hands trembled as she clutched the tin plate. She hadn't cried since she'd pieced together the fragments of her locket, and she wasn't about to start now, but a deep crack ran through the foundation of her resolve. "You can ride?" he asked. She nodded. "My wagon's out back. We head north about an hour's ride." Maeve hesitated only a second longer. She rose to her feet, leaving half the bacon on the plate. It felt wrong to take everything. The wagon groaned over the rutted trail, each jolt a stark reminder of her empty pockets and emptier future. They didn't speak. John handled the reins with a practiced ease, his posture relaxed, but his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Maeve sat beside him, her threadbare coat pulled tight, watching the dry hills roll beneath a sky the color of a faded bruise. The house appeared after a long bend in the ridge. It was a modest two-story structure, its weather-beaten pine frame silvered by years of sun and wind, with a porch that sagged like a tired man's shoulders. It wasn't a place of wealth, but everything was straight, solid, and cared for. Maeve's breath caught when she saw the children. They stood on the porch steps, a small, wary, welcoming party. The oldest, a boy of about 12, had his arms crossed, suspicion etched hard onto his face. The girl, 8 or 9, clutched a ragged doll, her eyes wide and curious. And the youngest, a boy of 6, with a slingshot in his hand and dirt on both cheeks, stared at her with open defiance. "Kids," John said as he hopped down from the wagon. "This is Miss Maeve. She's going to be helping out." None of them spoke. Maeve stepped down slowly, careful not to let the deep ache in her bones show. She offered a small, hesitant nod. "Hello?" The girl spoke first, her voice clear as a bell. "You smell like smoke." A smile surprised Maeve, a faint, rusty thing. "That's because I've been sleeping in a barn." The youngest boy snorted. The oldest didn't move a muscle. "You'll sleep upstairs," John said, breaking the tense silence. "Room used to be theirs. They've since taken over my space like a bunch of prairie dogs." Maeve followed him inside. The house smelled of firewood, old leather, and the faint, lingering scent of grief. It was lived in, messy but not neglected. Her room was small, with a narrow bed, a cracked wash basin, and a single window facing west toward the setting sun. She set down the small bundle that contained everything she owned in the world. John stood in the doorway. "I don't expect gratitude," he said. "Just effort. Fair work for fair keep." "Fair," she agreed. "I rise at 4. Breakfast by 5. Kids out the door by 6. You up for it?" Maeve nodded. "I've been waking up earlier than that with nowhere to go." He gave another one of his small, decisive nods, and then left her alone. That night, Maeve barely slept. The wind moaned through the cracks in the window frame, a lonely sound she knew well. But it wasn't the noise that kept her awake. It was the quiet, the strange, profound absence of fear. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't waiting for footsteps in an alley, for a rough hand on her shoulder, for someone to demand she move on. She lay still, listening to the slow, sleeping breath of a house filled with life, and felt a terrifying flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in years. It felt like hope. The next morning came cold and sharp. Maeve was downstairs long before the first hint of dawn, moving through the unfamiliar kitchen, like a woman trying to remember a long-forgotten dance. She found flour oats coffee. By the time John came in, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor, so the air was filled with the scent of biscuits baking. "You don't sleep in," he observed. It wasn't a question. "Not anymore," she said. He didn't smile, but the look he gave her held a quiet approval that was worth more. The children trickled in, one by one. The youngest, Tommy, dragged a wooden horse behind him. He blinked at Maeve and then mumbled, "Is the bacon burnt again?" She simply handed him a plate. He took a bite of a biscuit, his eyes widening in surprise, and then ate with the fervent hunger of a boy who'd grown accustomed to his father's cooking. The girl Clara shyly helped set the table. Luke, the eldest, remained a fortress of silent disapproval, his eyes tracking Maeve's every move. She didn't push him. Trust, she knew, was built in inches, not miles. John left at sunup, taking Luke and Clara to mend a fence line in the east pasture. Maeve was left with Tommy, the quiet house, and a mountain of chores. She taught the boy how to properly tie his boots, how to sweep without just moving the dust around. By midday, her hands were raw from lye soap and hot water. But when Tommy laughed a bright, genuine sound as he made a face in the soap suds, a warmth spread through her chest. It felt dangerous. Late that afternoon, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Maeve wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, a stark contrast to the dust and weathered wood of the ranch. She was tall, dressed in a traveling suit of dark wool that was far too fine for the trail, her expression as sharp as broken glass. Her gaze swept over Maeve from the frayed hem of her dress to the stray hairs escaping her bun, and in that single dismissive glance, Maeve felt herself shrink. A cold knot formed in her stomach. "I'm looking for John Merrick," the woman said. Her voice was polished, articulate, and held an unmistakable air of authority. "He's out in the eastern field," Maeve replied, keeping her own voice even. The woman didn't move. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Maeve. "Tell him Abigail stopped by," she said. "He'll know what for." Without another word, she turned and walked back to the waiting buggy, her posture ramrod straight. Maeve closed the door slowly, the woman's name echoing in her mind. Abigail. She didn't know who she was, but she had a feeling that whatever that woman had come for, it wasn't good. And it wasn't over. When John returned at dusk, dirt-streaked and weary, Maeve told him about the visitor. She watched his face carefully as she spoke. His posture didn't change, but a familiar tension settled in his jaw. "She say what she wanted?" he asked, his back to her as he washed his hands in the basin. "Only said you'd know." He sighed a deep, tired sound. "I do. She's my late wife's sister." The information landed with a soft thud. Maeve tried to reconcile the cold, imperious woman on the porch with the idea of family of grief. It didn't fit. "She thinks I should have left this place after Sarah." After the fire, John explained, his voice rough. "Thinks I should sell the land, send the kids back east to live with her." "Why didn't you?" Maeve asked softly. He turned to face her, then his eyes dark with a conviction that was as solid as the mountains behind them. "Because this is our home. This land, these children, they're all I have left of her. They're my choice." "She doesn't seem like the kind to let go easily," Maeve observed. "She isn't." They stood in the deepening twilight and the scent of sagebrush drifting in through the open door. For a fragile moment, Maeve felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that she was part of the quiet defiance of this house, this family. But she knew women like Abigail. They didn't just visit, they laid siege. And the first shot had just been fired. The days that followed were a fragile truce. Maeve settled into a rhythm, her life measured by the rising of the sun and the needs of the children. She learned that Clara loved stories, but was afraid of the dark, that Tommy collected smooth gray stones, and that Luke, for all his scowling, always made sure the woodbox was full before he went to bed. She slowly chipped away at his hostility, not with kindness he would mistrust, but with consistency. She was there every morning. Supper was always on the table. She never raised her voice. Slowly, imperceptibly, the boy's shoulders began to relax in her presence. One afternoon, while mending a tear in one of Luke's shirts in the shade of the porch, Maeve felt a pull to walk toward the ruins. About 100 yards from the house stood the charred foundation of what had been the original homestead where John and Sarah had first lived. It was where Sarah had died caught in a fire that had been ruled a terrible accident a year prior. A cold dread settled over her as she approached the blackened timbers. The place felt haunted not by a ghost, but by an unanswered question. She picked her way through the debris, the scent of old smoke still clinging to the air. Something glinted in the dirt near the collapsed hearth. Curious, she knelt and dug it out. It was a man's cufflink, ornate and made of silver, shaped like a serpent eating its tail. It wasn't John's style at all. His things were plain functional. And more than that, the design was chillingly familiar. It was the same symbol that had been branded onto the glove of the stagecoach robber. Her blood ran cold. It couldn't be a coincidence. She wrapped the cufflink in a scrap of cloth and tucked it deep into her apron pocket, her mind racing. What was a piece of jewelry like this doing in the ashes of Sarah Merrick's home? Her unease was amplified 2 days later by the arrival of another visitor. He was a man named Gerald Langston, a land speculator from Sweet Rock, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes that were too shrewd. He said he was just making a friendly offer on the property, but his words were laced with something else. A man in your position, John, with 3 children. This land is a heavy burden. Langston said, his tone slick with false sympathy. And that stream running through your south pasture priceless. There are men who would do a great deal to have access to that water. John's response was curt. The land's not for sale. Langston smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. Think it over. Things have a way of getting complicated out here. A man alone can't protect everything. The veiled threat hung in the air long after he had gone. That night, Maeve saw John cleaning his rifle by the firelight, his movements slow and deliberate. She knew he wasn't just cleaning a tool. He was preparing for a war. The war arrived under the banner of Abigail Crowley. She returned a week later this time, not alone. She brought the town sheriff a man with a weary face and a badge that looked too heavy for his coat. John, Abigail, began, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern. I've filed a formal petition with the magistrate. I'm worried about the children's welfare. Her eyes flicked to Maeve. Living here with her, a transient woman of unknown character. It's not a stable environment. This is my home, Abigail. These are my children. John said, his voice dangerously low. Our concern, the sheriff interjected clearly. Uncomfortable is about the fire at the barn last week, and now this stranger living here. The petition claims you're creating an unsafe environment. The fire hadn't been mentioned in town. Only John, Maeve, and the children knew about it. And Abigail. She's starting rumors, Maeve said quietly to John after they'd gone. She's building a case against you, piece by piece. The pressure mounted. Whispers followed Maeve when she went into Sweet Rock for supplies. Doors that had once been open to John were now closed. The community was turning against them, poisoned by Abigail's calculated campaign. The ranch began to feel less like a home and more like an island, with a hostile sea rising on all sides. The breaking point came on a moonless night. John was late returning from a trip to a neighboring ranch to trade for seed. Maeve was putting the children to bed when she heard the sound of approaching horses, too many and moving too fast. She sent the children to hide and grabbed the rifle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She stood in the darkened doorway waiting. 3 riders emerged from the gloom. They circled the house, once their faces hidden in shadow. Then one of them dismounted and walked toward the porch. Maeve recognized him instantly. Even without the mask, she knew the confident, cruel set of his shoulders. It was the man with the serpent brand. "We're looking for John Merrick," he called out, his voice laced with a cold amusement. "Got some business with him regarding some property." Before Maeve could answer, a shot rang out from the trees behind the house. John. He must have seen them coming and circled around. One of the riders cried out and fell from his saddle. The leader cursed and dove for cover behind a water trough. The third man spurred his horse and galloped back into the darkness. A tense, deadly silence fell. Maeve could hear her own blood roaring in her ears. Merrick, the leader, shouted, his voice tight with rage. "You should have sold when you had the chance." Another shot from John, this one, splintering the wood of the trough. Maeve used the distraction to slip out the back door, moving silently through the shadows toward the east side of the house. John's voice cut through the night, filled with a year's worth of suppressed fury. "You're Silas Croft. You were here the night my wife died." A cold laugh answered him. "Your wife was a casualty of business, Merrick. She shouldn't have been in the house. I was just there to leave a warning for you. A fire is a very persuasive argument for selling a piece of land." The confession hit Maeve like a physical blow. The cufflink, the fire. It hadn't been an accident. Sarah Merrick had been murdered. And Abigail John's voice was raw with dawning horror. "She's been in on this with you, her own sister?" "Abigail understands the value of progress," Croft sneered. "She knows this land, and its water is better off in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. She just needed you out of the picture." Maeve saw her opening. Croft was focused on John's position. She crept along the side of the house, the rifle feeling cold and heavy in her hands. She rounded the corner, just as Croft rose from behind the trough, his own pistol aimed toward the trees. "It's over, Croft," she said, her voice steady. He spun around, surprised. For a split second, his eyes widened as he recognized her from the stagecoach. That second was all she needed. She fired. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. Silas Croft staggered back, a look of disbelief on his face, before collapsing into the dust. John emerged from the trees, his face a grim mask. He looked at the body of the man who had killed his wife, then at Maeve standing in the moonlight with the smoking rifle in her hands. The secrets were out, laid bare in the cold night air. The fight for the land had just become a fight for justice, and they were no longer just defending a home. They were avenging a murder. With the truth exposed, the nature of the war changed. It was no longer a cold campaign of rumors and legal threats. It became hot, personal, and deadly. Silas Croft was dead, but his organization and his alliance with Abigail remained. They knew that Croft's remaining hired gun, the one who had fled, would report back. Retaliation would be swift. "We can't stay here," John said, his voice strained as he stared at Croft's body. "They'll come back with more men." "And go where," Maeve countered, reloading the rifle with practiced, steady hands. "This is your land. If we run, Abigail wins. She gets the children, she gets the ranch, and she gets away with helping to murder her own sister." A grim resolve settled over John's features. He looked at the house, at the faint light in the window, where he knew his children were huddled, and nodded. "You're right. We don't run. We make our stand." They dragged Croft's body and that of his man into the woodshed, a grim task that solidified their pact. There was no going back. They spent the rest of the night fortifying the cabin, boarding up windows, and moving furniture to create barricades. Maeve worked with a fierce, focused energy. This was no longer just John's fight. It was hers. This home, this family had given her a reason to stand, and she would not let it be taken from her. The next day passed in a state of tense anticipation. The sky was a vast, empty blue plate, and the silence of the prairie felt heavy, expectant. The children, sensing the shift, were quiet and stayed close, their games forgotten. Luke, his animosity toward Maeve, burned away. By the shared danger, followed her everywhere, watching her learning. "Show me how to load it," he said, gesturing to the spare rifle. Maeve looked at John, who gave a slow, pained nod. She showed the boy her instructions, calm and clear. "You only point it at something you mean to shoot. You only shoot when I tell you. Understand?" "I understand," Luke said, his young face set with a gravity that broke Maeve's heart. As dusk began to settle, painting the mesas in shades of purple and orange, John made a discovery. While patrolling the southern fence line, he found fresh tracks and a length of rope tied to a tree overlooking the stream and the very water source Langston had mentioned. Following the tracks, he found a small, hastily abandoned camp. In the dying embers of a fire pit, he found a half-burnt piece of paper. It was a map of his property, with the house, the barn, and the stream clearly marked. And at the bottom, a note in a familiar, elegant script. "The fire must look like an accident. Destroy the new barn first, and it will break his spirit." It was signed, simply, A. Abigail. She hadn't just been an ally to Silas. She was an active strategist. She was orchestrating this. John returned to the house, his face pale with fury. He showed Maeve the note. "She wants to burn us out," he said, his voice a low growl. "Just like she did Sarah." The words were barely out of his mouth when they smelled it. Smoke. Not the gentle scent of their own hearth, but the acrid, greedy smell of hay and dry timber catching fire. They rushed outside. Flames were already licking up the side of the new barn, the one John had spent months rebuilding. It was a deliberate, vicious act, a message and an attack rolled into one. "It's a diversion," Maeve realized instantly, her eyes scanning the tree line. "They want to draw us out." "Luke, get the children to the root cellar." "Now," John commanded. "Bar the door from the inside and don't come out no matter what you hear." As Luke herded a terrified Clara and Tommy toward the house, 2 rifle shots cracked from the ridge overlooking the ranch. John shoved Maeve toward the cover of the house as splinters flew from the porch railing where she had just been standing. "They've got us pinned," he grunted, firing a shot back toward the ridge to provide cover. They scrambled inside the cabin, the roaring fire of the barn casting dancing, monstrous shadows through the windows. The heat was becoming intense, the air thick with smoke. They were trapped. The attackers on the ridge had them boxed in while the fire crept closer, threatening to consume everything. "We have to move," Maeve said, coughing as smoke began to fill the kitchen. "They're trying to flush us out into the open." John looked at the smoldering note from Abigail, his eyes filled with a cold, hard rage. "She's not just trying to break my spirit," he said. "She's trying to finish what she and Croft started. She wants to erase us." He moved to the back window, peering out into the growing darkness. "There's one on the ridge to the west, and at least one more near the trees by the stream. They're closing a circle around us." Maeve thought of the children huddled in the dark cellar beneath the floorboards, and a fierce protective instinct rose up in her, extinguishing all fear. "Then we'll have to break their circle," she said, her voice resolute. "They think we're just a grieving rancher and a housekeeper. They're about to find out what we really are." They were no longer victims defending their home. They were survivors united by a shared purpose, ready to fight back against the darkness that sought to swallow them whole. The sky began to bleed. The setting sun filtered through the rising smoke, and the first heralds of an approaching dust storm cast the world in a surreal, hellish orange light. The wind began to howl a low moan that rose in pitch until it screamed, whipping dust and embers into a blinding frenzy. It was a storm born of the dry earth and the rage of the sky. And it was their only ally. "They won't be able to see us move in this," Maeve shouted over the gale, pulling a bandana over her nose and mouth. "It's our chance." John nodded, his face grim. "I'll go out the back circle around toward the stream. You keep them busy from the front. The wind will cover my sound." "John, no, it's too dangerous." "They killed my wife," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "They're trying to kill my children. Danger doesn't matter anymore. Justice does." He gripped her shoulder, his eyes meeting hers in the dim, flickering light. "Keep them safe, Maeve." Before she could argue, he was gone, slipping out the back door like a shadow into the maelstrom. Maeve was alone. She moved to the front window, peering through a crack in the boards. Visibility was near zero. The world was a churning vortex of red dust and screaming wind. She could barely see the burning barns now, just a raging silhouette against the storm. A rifle cracked nearby, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the wind. They were getting closer, using the storm as cover. Maeve fired back, aiming not at a target, but at the sound, trying to keep their heads down. Grit flew in through the cracks in the walls, coating everything, stinging her eyes. The house groaned under the assault of the wind, a timber and bone creature in its death throes. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, the rumble of a buggy, its wheels straining against the rough terrain. Through a momentary lull in the dust, Maeve saw it cresting the ridge. It was Abigail. She had come to watch her victory, dressed in black, as if for a funeral theirs. She stood beside the buggy, a lone, stark figure, against the apocalyptic sky, her face a mask of triumphant disdain. At the same time, Maeve heard a crash from the side of the house. One of the attackers was trying to break in through a window. She spun, leveling her rifle just as a man clambered through the shattered frame. She fired without hesitation. He fell back with a strangled cry. Another shot came from the ridge, closer this time. John was drawing their fire. Maeve knew she had to create a diversion of her own to pull their attention away from his position. She grabbed a lantern, lit it, and threw it with all her might toward a stack of dry firewood near the porch. It burst into flames, a beacon in the storm. From her vantage point, Abigail saw the new fire erupt. She must have believed the house itself was now burning. But she also saw something else. Down by the stream where John had disappeared, a figure emerged from the dust. It was Gerald Langston, Silas's man, and he was dragging a wounded John behind him, a pistol to his head. Abigail's plan had worked. She had her victory. Langston shoved John forward toward the center of the yard. "It's over." Crowley Langston shouted toward her, his voice thin against the wind. "We have him. Your plan worked." A cruel smile touched Abigail's lips. She began to walk forward, a predator approaching her captured prey. "Excellent work, Mr. Langston." Silas would have been proud. "About my payment," Langston started. "Silas is dead," Abigail cut him off, her voice like ice. "Any arrangements you had were with him. I have what I wanted. The land, the children. Their legacy is now mine to control. You are no longer of any use to me." Langston's face contorted with rage. "You treacherous." "We had a deal. Silas promised me a share." "Silas made many promises he couldn't keep," Abigail said coolly, pulling a small derringer from her sleeve. "As it turns out, so do I." She aimed the pistol not at John, but at Langston. In that moment of betrayal, rage, and desperation gave Langston a burst of strength. He shoved John to the ground and lunged for the ranch's spare wagon parked nearby. Maeve watched in stunned disbelief as he kicked over a barrel of lamp oil stored beside it. With a roar of fury, he threw his own lit lantern onto the spill. The wagon exploded into a wall of flame, a massive, brilliant fireball that lit up the dust-choked yard. The sudden, violent eruption sent Abigail staggering backward, shielding her face. It was the diversion they needed. In the chaos, John scrambled for his dropped rifle. Maeve burst from the front door, firing at the remaining gunman on the ridge, forcing him to take cover. The fight had turned. Langston, consumed by his own act of vengeful destruction, was silhouetted perfectly against the blaze. Abigail, seeing her victory unravel into chaos, screamed in frustration and fired her derringer wildly into the smoke. John got to his feet, rifle in hand. He and Maeve now stood back to back in the swirling dust, surrounded by fire and enemies. But they were no longer pinned down. They were no longer defending. The storm had broken the siege, and Abigail's own treachery had given them the weapon they needed to fight back. In the heart of the fire and the dust, two broken souls stood together, ready to reclaim their future from the ashes. The aftermath was an eerie tableau of smoke and silence. The wind, as if its work was done, began to die down, allowing the thick red dust to settle like a shroud over the yard. The burning wagon and the smoldering barn cast a flickering, hellish glow on the scene. Langston was dead, caught in the blaze of his own making. The final gunman had fled into the dying storm, and Abigail stood alone, a statue of disbelief, her fine dress smudged with soot, her face a canvas of defeated rage. She was unarmed, her tiny derringer lost in the dirt. John and Maeve approached her slowly, rifles held steady. The fight was gone from her eyes, replaced by a hollow, brittle emptiness. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered more to herself than to them. I was supposed to save them. Save her legacy. Sarah's legacy is her children. John said, his voice raw with exhaustion and grief. Not this land. Not your ambition. You dishonored her memory. Before Abigail could reply, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. A posse of men led by the Sweet Rock sheriff and a determined-looking Burke rode into the yard. Burke had made it through. He had brought the law. The sheriff took in the scene, the bodies, the fires, the armed couple, and the broken woman standing amidst the ruin. Abigail Crowley, he said, his voice heavy with grim authority, you're under arrest. For conspiracy for incitement to violence. And for suspicion of murder. Two deputies dismounted and took Abigail into custody. She didn't resist. As they led her away, her eyes met Maeve's one last time. There was no hatred left in them, only a vast, bewildering loss. With the immediate threat gone, the adrenaline receded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a landscape of pain. John sagged against a porch post, and the rifle slipping from his grasp. Maeve rushed to his side, gently examining the wound on his head, where Langston had struck him. It's just a cut, he mumbled, but his face was pale, his body trembling with shock and strain. She led him inside the smoke-filled but still standing cabin. They moved with the slow, careful motions of people tending to the sacred wreckage of their lives. Maeve found a clean rag and began to gently clean the gash on his temple. Their hands brushed, and a current of shared survival more intimate than any touch passed between them. You didn't have to stay. John said, his voice barely a whisper. You could have left 100 times. Maeve paused, the rag held still against his skin. She looked at him at the lines of pain and exhaustion etched onto his face, and felt a profound, aching certainty. "I wasn't fighting for the land, John," she said softly. "I was fighting for my family." His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a gratitude and an emotion so deep it needed no words. He reached up and gently cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing a line through the soot on her skin. In that quiet, desperate moment, surrounded by the remnants of their battle, they acknowledged the bond that had been forged between them, a bond of shared loss, shared struggle, and a fierce, unspoken love. A small sound from the floorboards broke the spell. The trapdoor to the root cellar creaked open. 3 small, terrified faces peered up into the dim light. Luke, his face smudged with dirt, climbed out first, followed by Clara and a trembling Tommy. They saw their father wounded but alive. They saw Maeve standing beside him like a guardian. Without a word, they all rushed forward, wrapping their arms around both of them, a tangle of small limbs and silent tears. John and Maeve knelt embracing the children, pulling them into a tight circle of warmth and safety. The house was damaged, the ranch was in ruins, but in that moment, huddled together on the dusty floor, they were whole. They were home. Months later, the ranch was reborn. The relentless sun of a new spring shone down on a new barn, its fresh pine boards smelling of sap and promise. The house had been repaired, its windows replaced, its walls scrubbed clean of soot and sorrow. The land, resilient and forgiving, was green again. The community of Sweet Rock, shamed by their complicity and awed by the truth Burke's evidence had laid bare, had rallied around the Merrick family. Neighbors arrived with lumber food, and helping hands, their quiet work a long, unspoken apology. Silas Croft's empire had crumbled, his network of corruption exposed. Abigail Crowley, stripped of her wealth and reputation, was serving a long sentence in a federal prison back east, a broken woman haunted by the legacy she had destroyed in her quest to possess it. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, one of healing and quiet joy. John's laughter, once a rare and rusty sound, became more frequent. The children, freed from the shadow of fear, filled the days with noise and life. And Maeve, no longer a ghost at the edge of their world, was its heart. One sun-drenched afternoon, while clearing the last of the debris from the site of the old burned-out homestead, Maeve's shovel struck something hard. She knelt and dug into the soil, her fingers closing around a small metal object, blackened by fire but intact. It was a locket. Not hers, but a silver one, tarnished and scorched. She worked the clasp with gentle fingers until, with a soft click, it sprang open. Inside, miraculously preserved from the flames, was a tiny, exquisitely painted portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Sarah Merrick. Maeve carried it back to the house, her heart full. That evening, as the family gathered for supper, she walked to the newly built mantelpiece above the hearth. On one side stood a recent, roughly made frame, holding a drawing Tommy had made of their new blended family, a stick figure of John, 3 smaller ones for the children, and one for Maeve, all holding hands under a smiling sun. With a quiet reverence, Maeve took the scorched silver locket and placed it on the other side of the mantelpiece. She didn't hide it. She didn't erase it. She gave it a place of honor. John came to stand beside her, his arms settling around her shoulders. He looked at the portrait of his first wife, then at the woman who had saved his family, and finally at the children's drawing. The past and the future resting side by side, held together by the present. "Thank you," he whispered. Maeve leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the firelight dance across both images. She had arrived here with nothing, a barren woman with a broken heart, seeking only shelter from the wind. She had found something more. She had found that a home is not a place you find, but a place you build, and that a family is not born only of blood, but forged in the fires of survival and cemented by the quiet courage of love.